On the same day, two disciples were traveling to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking to each other about everything that had happened. While they were discussing these things, Jesus himself arrived and joined them on their journey. They were prevented from recognizing him. He said to them, "What are you talking about as you walk along?" They stopped, their faces downcast. The one named Cleopas replied, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who is unaware of the things that have taken place there over the last few days?" He said to them, "What things?" They said to him, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth." Because of his powerful deeds and words, he was recognized by God and all of the people as the prophet. But our chief priests and our leaders handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the one who would redeem Israel. All these things happened 3 days ago. But there's more. Some women from our group have left us stunned. They went to the tomb early this morning and didn't find his body. They came to us saying that they had even seen a vision of angels who told them he is alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found things just as the women said. They didn't see him. Then Jesus said to them, "You foolish people, your dull minds keep you from believing all the prophets have talked about. Wasn't it necessary for the Christ to suffer these things, then enter into his glory?" Then he interpreted for them the things written about himself in all the scriptures, starting with Moses and going through all of the prophets. When they came to Emmaus, he acted as if he was going on ahead. But they urged him, saying, "Stay with us. It's nearly evening, and the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. After he took his seat at the table with them, he took the bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. Their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. But he disappeared from sight. They said to each other, "Weren't our hearts on fire when he spoke to us along the road, and when he explained the scriptures to us?" They got up right then and returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying to each other, "The Lord has risen. He appeared to Simon." Then the two disciples described what happened along the road and how Jesus was made known to them as he broke the bread.
After Christ was no longer with his disciples in the flesh, several letters began to circulate, making the rounds to the early Christian communities. This one is from a letter called 1 Peter that is recorded in our New Testament. It reminds people that the story of Jesus is about new birth for all. And we are to be seeds of God's life-giving love.
Christ was chosen for the creation of the world, but was only revealed at the end of time. This was done for you, who through Christ are faithful to the God who raised him from the dead and gave him glory. So now your faith and hope should rest in God. As you set yourselves apart by your obedience to the truth so that you might have genuine affection for your fellow believers, love each other deeply and earnestly. Do this because you have been given a new birth, not from the type of seed that decays, but from the seed that doesn't. This seed is God's life-giving and enduring word.
Martin Buber was the great theologian and philosopher and teacher of Judaism. And he once told a story about his grandfather. His grandfather was lame, and he was asked, what was his teacher like? Slowly, with great effort, his grandfather rose to his feet, and he began to tell the story of his teacher Baal She'em. And the more he began to tell the story, the more he began to wave his arms and talk like his teacher. He got so excited in telling the stories about his teacher that he began to walk and move around the room just like his teacher walked and moved when he would tell a story. And in the telling of that story, Buber's grandfather was no longer lame. He had gotten up and moved around and walked. He had lost himself in that story so much that he was healed. And according to Buber, from that day forward, he never was lame again. Such is the power of stories. There's a reason why we return to these gospel stories of resurrection appearances almost every year at church. Because these stories have the power to heal if we give ourselves over to them enough. By telling our stories of faith, maybe even our stories of our families, of our lives, when we entrust our stories with one another, they have the power to heal. One of the greatest joys of my time being a minister has been getting to sit down with people, share a cup of coffee or tea, and to hear their stories. Most people don't think too much of their background or what they've been through in life. But I have discovered over the years doing this kind of work that most people sell themselves pretty short. Most people are courageous, even heroic in ways that they don't consider courageous or heroic. Most people are survivors in some way of great pain and struggle in their lives. I am constantly amazed getting to hear people's stories and how often in the telling of them, people will realize in hindsight what they couldn't realize when they were going through the circumstances they're describing. What they often find out in hindsight, sometimes I have to point it out to them, is how God was working in their lives, or how something really painful, even awful, wasn't caused by God, but God somehow used that for them to grow and to learn. And through struggle and recovery, they became the people they have become. And that pain they experienced actually becomes something they can carry with them and even becomes a tool of healing to share with other people. In the times of my life where I've been fortunate enough to be invited to an open AA meeting or NA meeting, and I get to hear the stories of people in recovery, given with such vulnerability and bravery, because they're in a room with people who understand and who are not going to judge them. It has a healing effect because it shows the people present that they're not alone, that other people hurt, other people struggle, other people have weaknesses, other people fail, but that our higher powers can bring us through those times of struggle and failure. And that the struggle and failure are not the end. That there is more to life to come, and we can begin again. Our stories about the resurrection appearances are in their own way stories about beginning again and starting over in dealing with feelings of failure. The story in Luke's gospel is of a disciple we haven't known before, a follower named Cleopas, and he has an unnamed companion. Feminist scholars have pointed out that if his companion was actually a man, he probably would have been named too. But it was common in ancient writings to only name the man when a couple was together. And so most likely it was Cleopas and his wife journeying together. And the language that they're using doesn't translate well in our English translations. The English makes it seem like they were having a pleasant discussion, maybe a Sunday stroll out and enjoying the nice day. But in fact, the language is much more than a discussion. It's really an argument. Their language, according to the Greek, is emphatic. It is emotional, even combative, as they are discussing what happened to Jesus and what did it all mean, if it even meant anything. And on this occasion of this couple having an argument walking down the road, a stranger appears, asks them what they're arguing about, and they begin to share. And they share the painful words, "We had hoped." What were they so upset about? Well, Bible scholar Caroline Lewis puts it this way. She says, the distance between Jerusalem and Emmaus on a map is not very far, a rather easy walk. But the distance between the words, "we had hoped," and the words, "the Lord has risen indeed," is a much greater distance. How painful are the words "we had hoped"? Cleopas and his spouse say, "We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. And we had heard the stories that he had risen from some of the women in our group. But according to the English translation, we thought it was idle talk or women's tales, according to some. But really the Greek is stronger still. It is the babbling of very sick people. In other words, the women were so upset they were delusional. They're being dismissed. And then the stranger says something to them. Says in some English translations, "You fools," which strikes me as pretty harsh. Some scholars say that the language here of the upset couple, the language of the babbling by very sick people, is all representative of what in ancient writings was called a therapeutic discourse. In other words, what we have here is not just a talk as three people stroll, but what we have here is a therapy session. In other words, this stranger is sort of providing couples counseling. And if we see it as a context of therapy, of healing, then maybe Jesus' words weren't so harsh. Maybe they were given with a smile, an understanding smile. "You foolish ones." Or maybe, "You silly dummies." Maybe it wasn't judgment, but more of a caring understanding. I don't know. I've met with some couples who were so upset with each other that I literally had to raise my voice to make them stop and listen. So maybe Jesus had to say, "You fools." I'm not sure. But the stranger expounds the scripture to them and explains what it all means. And then the couple has a choice. They turn off to go to the home in Emmaus, maybe their home, and the stranger is going to keep going. And they offer hospitality to a stranger. They invite him into their home, and when they break bread together, Suddenly their eyes are opened, and they see that their stranger was no stranger at all, but Christ with them. And they ask each other, were not our hearts burning inside of us? Were not our hearts burning inside of us when he was here? And so, what does this show us? That in these times of stress, where we may be driven crazy by all of our family being home if we're so fortunate to work from home, where our kids are out of school, where we're worried about so much, where we are bombarded by bad news every day, even confusing news, and it's difficult to know whom to trust. What this says is Christ is not far off from us, but the universal Christ is present with us always, even in our homes. We may not be able to go to church together, but we don't need to go to church, to a building, to visit Christ. I've wondered why so often church people think that when they go on their weekly pilgrimage to their church building every Sunday morning or sometime over the weekend, if that's the only time in their week they've carved out for God. And don't get me wrong, I'm glad folks show up, and I'm glad that they've at least made that much time in their weekly schedule for God. But that's not all there is. This passage points to the fact that Christ is there with us, at home, in our homes, whether we're in an apartment, a condo, a retirement community, a house, or wherever. Christ is there with us and with you and with me even now. And when we break bread together, when we share with one another, when we open our hearts to strangers, even when we have to do it via a text or an email or a call or FaceTime or Zoom or whatever, that's where we experience Christ. And our hearts can beat, being on fire, experiencing that presence of Christ with us wherever we are, if we'll just open ourselves to it and see the love we have for those around us. For the risen Christ this Easter season calls us out of our despair, calls us out of our worry and our fear and our stress, and says to us, I am with you. Open your hearts. Let them burn with love. Amen.